In 1856, a 9-year-old enslaved girl named Sarah Sutton was buried alive on a plantation in Mississippi. 3 days later, she clawed her way back out of her grave. What followed would turn Blackwood Plantation into the most feared place in the South. It became a story people whispered about but never said out loud, a story of death and revenge that no one could truly explain and everyone wanted erased from memory. This is that story. It was August 1856 at Blackwood Plantation, Mississippi. The heat felt like a living creature, pressing down on everything, making it difficult to breathe, difficult to think, and difficult just to stay alive. The cotton fields stretched endlessly, white and blinding beneath a sky so blue it almost hurt to stare at. 300 acres of wealth stood there, built entirely on the backs of people who owned nothing at all, not even their own bodies. The plantation belonged to Margaret Sutton, a 48-year-old widow who had inherited it after her husband died in 1852. Margaret was tall and narrow, with gray eyes that hardly ever blinked and a mouth that almost never smiled. She ran the plantation with absolute control, determined to prove that a woman could manage such a place just as well as any man, if not better. She kept careful records of every expense, every bale of cotton, and every enslaved person along with their assigned value. To Margaret, the plantation was simply a business. The people who worked it were inventory, nothing more than numbers on a page. Before continuing with Sarah's story, remember to comment which city you are listening from and subscribe to the channel. Your support is what keeps these stories alive. Now let's continue. In 1856, a healthy adult male slave was worth around $1,200. A strong woman could sell for $800 to $1,000. Children were worth much less, with their value rising only as they grew older and proved they could work. In Margaret's ledger, Sarah Sutton was listed at $250, less than 1/4 of an adult's value. Margaret believed this was generous. Many plantation owners would have valued a sickly child at $100 or less. Some would have sold Sarah south to the sugar plantations of Louisiana, where life expectancy was counted in years instead of decades, where workers died so quickly they had to be constantly replaced. Sarah carried the Sutton name not because of family ties, but because of ownership. She was born on the plantation in 1847, the daughter of a woman named Ruth, who had been valued at $900 in Margaret's husband's ledger. Ruth died giving birth to Sarah, reducing the plantation's assets by $900 and adding only $250 in return. From a business point of view, Sarah's birth was a loss of $650. Margaret's husband had written this down with clear irritation. From her very first breath, Sarah was marked as different. She was small even as a baby, weighing barely 5 pounds. She grew slowly and stayed thin no matter how much she ate. Her skin was lighter than most of the other enslaved children, suggesting her father was white, though no one dared speak about who he might have been. Some whispered that it was Margaret's late husband, but those whispers never lasted. Dangerous questions often led to people being sold or something far worse. By the age of 9, Sarah stood barely 4 feet tall and weighed around 50 pounds. She looked closer to 6 than 9. Her eyes were large and dark, far too old for her young face, as if she had already seen things no child ever should. She hardly ever spoke, and when she did, her voice was so soft that people had to lean close just to hear her. She did not play with the other children. She did not run, laugh, or sing the songs that echoed through the quarters at night. She worked quietly and carefully, doing her best to remain unseen. Margaret called her the weak one, and noted in her ledger that Sarah's value might need to be lowered to $150 if she did not improve. The overseer, a cruel man named Coleman Briggs, called her dead weight and much worse. Briggs was 35, built like a bull, with hands that had broken bones and a whip he used far too often. He earned $60 a month plus room and board, making him one of the highest paid overseers in Yazoo County. He had worked at Blackwood for 6 years, earning his role through cruelty and strict efficiency. Briggs believed enslaved people were animals that needed to be broken, and he took pride in his ability to crush even the strongest spirits. He had gained a reputation across 3 counties as an overseer who could make any plantation profitable by forcing maximum output from workers. His methods were brutal but effective, at least in the short term. In 6 years at Blackwood, cotton production had risen by 40%. That he had also buried 23 workers, including 7 children, during that same time was seen as an acceptable cost of doing business. But Sarah confused him. You could not break someone who never fought back. You could not scare someone who already seemed afraid of everything. You could not motivate someone who appeared to have given up on life before it truly began. So Briggs simply pushed her harder. He forced her beyond what her small body could manage, hoping she would either grow stronger or die. He did not care which outcome came first. To him, she was a waste of food and supplies, taking more than she produced and lowering the plantation's overall efficiency. The other enslaved people at Blackwood watched Sarah with a mix of pity and frustration. An elderly woman named Esther, who had lived on the plantation for 40 years and was now valued at only $150 due to her age and weakness, tried to watch over Sarah when she could. Esther had been purchased in 1816 for $600, considered prime breeding stock at the age of 20. Over 25 years she gave birth to 11 children. 8 were sold away. 3 died in childhood. Through her children alone she had earned the plantation thousands of dollars. Now worn down and old, she was worth little more than the sick child she tried to protect. Esther would secretly give Sarah extra food when possible, even though rations were carefully controlled. Each worker received about 1 peck of cornmeal per week, 3 to 4 pounds of salt pork or bacon, and occasional molasses or vegetables. This diet, costing the plantation roughly 20 cents per person per day, was designed to keep workers functioning but never comfortable. Esther shared her own portions, helped Sarah with difficult tasks when no one was watching, and held her at night when Sarah woke screaming from nightmares she never spoke about. Esther said Sarah reminded her of a bird with a broken wing, still alive but unable to fly, waiting for something to end its pain. She told the other women in the quarters that Sarah would not live to see 15. The child was too weak, too fragile, not meant for this world. Better, she said, for her to go to God sooner rather than later, before life crushed what little spirit she had left. The other women nodded quietly. They had seen too many children die to argue. In their experience, death was sometimes the kindest fate an enslaved child could have. There was a young man named Daniel, around 20 years old, valued at $1,200 in Margaret's ledger. He was strong and intelligent, worth his high price, with many years of labor ahead of him. Born on the plantation to 2 valuable workers, he had grown into exactly the kind of asset Margaret admired. During peak season, he could pick 200 pounds of cotton a day. He could fix tools, repair equipment, and read numbers well enough to keep simple records, making him useful beyond the fields. Daniel often worked near Sarah. He tried to help her, carrying her cotton sack when it grew too heavy or finishing her row when she fell behind. But Briggs noticed everything, and helping someone else meant punishment for both. Briggs knew that unity among enslaved people was dangerous. Workers who helped each other might begin to see themselves as a community instead of separate pieces of property. So he crushed any sign of cooperation, keeping everyone fearful and alone. Still, Daniel tried. He could not stop himself. Sarah's quiet suffering stirred something deep inside him, filling him with anger at an injustice he was never supposed to question. His mother warned him to keep his head down, to be grateful for his strength, to not waste emotion on things he could not change. But watching Sarah struggle day after day, watching a child work herself toward death for people who valued her less than a decent horse, made him want to fight back in ways that could get him killed. Cotton harvest season ran from August through October and was the most important time of the year at Blackwood Plantation. The entire year's profit depended on getting the cotton picked, processed, and shipped. In 1856, cotton sold for about 11 cents per pound. A good worker picking 150 pounds a day produced roughly $16.50 worth of cotton daily. Over a 90-day harvest, that single worker could generate nearly $1,500 in revenue. After subtracting the yearly cost of food, clothing, and shelter, about $73, the profit was obvious. This was why plantation owners pushed workers so hard. This was why every number was calculated down to the last penny. This was why a child like Sarah, who could only pick 30 or 40 pounds a day, producing barely $3 or $4 worth of cotton, was seen as a burden. She barely covered the cost of keeping herself alive. In the cold math of slavery, she did not make sense. She was property that was losing value, costing more than it produced. Every enslaved person at Blackwood was expected to pick between 150 and 200 pounds of cotton per day. Adults who failed faced punishment, usually whipping and sometimes worse. Briggs kept strict records, weighing each person's cotton every evening, writing down the numbers, and comparing them to daily quotas. Those who exceeded their quota were sometimes given small rewards, an extra bit of food or a rare kindness, while those who fell short paid the price. Food, a free Sunday afternoon, or a small word of approval were treated as rewards. Anyone who failed to meet expectations faced punishments that grew harsher each time they failed. Children younger than 10 were required to pick at least 75 pounds each day. Sarah had never once reached that number. On her very best days, she might reach around 40. On most days, it was closer to 30. Every single day, she came up short. Margaret reduced her food portions based on how much she missed the target. If Sarah picked 40 pounds instead of 75, she was given about half the normal food that night. The reasoning was clear and cruel. If you did not produce enough to earn your food, you did not deserve it. The fact that this system caused a steady collapse, where hungry workers grew weaker, worked even less, and then lost even more food, did not bother Margaret at all. In her mind, the weak were meant to die. That was nature's rule. That was how strong stock was created. Briggs added his own punishments on top of hers. He forced Sarah to work through meal breaks. He assigned her to the hottest and hardest rows. He stood over her, criticizing her every move, mocking her, and sometimes hitting her on the back of the head when she slowed down. He told her she was useless, that she was stealing from the plantation, that she should be thankful Mrs. Sutton did not sell her to the sugar fields where she would be dead within a year. August 15, 1856 began like any other day. The sun rose hot and harsh. The sky was already bright by 50 am when the bell rang, calling everyone to the fields. Sarah pulled herself out of the small cabin she shared with Esther and 5 other women. The cabin was about 16 by 20 feet and held 7 people. Each person had around 46 square feet of space, about the size of a modern prison cell. There were no windows, only gaps in the walls to let air in. There was no furniture except rough wooden sleeping platforms. There was no privacy and no comfort. Sarah had slept badly, as she always did. Her body ached all the time now. Her bones and muscles hurt with a constant pain that never faded. Lately she had been coughing more, a dry and painful cough that made her chest burn and sometimes brought up tiny flecks of blood. Esther said it was from the cotton dust. She said many children became sick from breathing it in every day, year after year. The tiny fibers settled in the lungs and never left, causing endless irritation and infection. Some people recovered, most did not. Esther had watched it happen dozens of times over her 40 years. A child would begin coughing, then grow weaker, then slowly waste away until one day they simply stopped breathing. That morning, Sarah stepped into the dim early light and joined the line of people walking toward the fields. No one spoke much at that hour. Everyone was too tired, too hungry, and too focused on surviving another day. They moved in silence like ghosts in the gray morning, heading toward another long day of cruel labor under a burning sun, all for people who saw them as animals. By noon, Sarah had picked only about 15 pounds of cotton. Her small fingers were cut and bleeding from the sharp cotton bolls that tore skin with every grab. She moved as fast as she could, but she was painfully slow. Each bowl had to be opened with both hands to pull out the cotton cleanly, then stuffed into the sack dragging behind her. Her back screamed from bending over without rest. The sun showed no mercy. The heat pressed down so hard the air seemed to shimmer. She had been given 1 cup of water at sunrise and would not get another until sunset. 12 hours later, this was normal during harvest time. Water breaks were seen as wasted time. Margaret had calculated that water breaks lowered daily output by about 8%. So workers were given water only twice a day and expected to cope. When people collapsed from heat or thirst, it was considered unfortunate but acceptable. Lost productivity from water breaks mattered more than the occasional dead worker. Sarah's mouth was painfully dry. Her tongue stuck to her teeth. She felt dizzy, as if the ground was tilting and the world was not steady. Her vision blurred again and again. She had to stop, close her eyes, and breathe deeply to fight the urge to lie down in the dirt and never get up. But lying down meant punishment. It meant Briggs would come with his whip or his fists. It meant even less food that night. So she kept going, kept picking, her small hands slowing more and more as the heat and exhaustion crushed her. Around 1:00 p.m., Briggs rode through the fields on his horse, checking on the workers and counting their sacks. He carried a small scale and randomly weighed sacks to make sure no one was adding dirt or stones, something desperate workers sometimes tried. His whip was coiled on his saddle and a pistol hung at his hip. The pistol was loaded. He had used it twice in 6 years, shooting workers who tried to escape. Both died. Both deaths were ruled legal self-defense. A slave trying to run was considered stolen property, and deadly force to stop theft was allowed. When Briggs reached Sarah's row, he climbed down and grabbed her nearly empty sack. He weighed it in his hand, his face darkening. 15 pounds. In 8 hours you picked 15. His voice rang across the field, loud and furious, meant for everyone to hear. Other workers stopped and watched, afraid of what was coming but unable to look away. They had seen this many times before, with many different children. It always ended the same way. Sarah stared at the ground, swaying slightly. She whispered, "I'm sorry, sir. I'm trying my best." Her voice was so soft Briggs had to lean closer to hear her. That only made him angrier. He hated it when they were this submissive, when they did not fight back enough to make punishment feel satisfying. Your best is 15 pounds. Do you know what you cost this plantation? Do you know what Mrs. Sutton pays to feed your useless mouth? He grabbed her arm and jerked her upright, shaking her. 20 cents a day. That's what it costs to keep you alive. 20 cents for food, shelter, and the clothes you wear. 15 pounds of cotton is worth $1.65. Do you know how many days it takes you to earn 1 day of food? About 8 days. You're stealing from this plantation. You're stealing food from people who actually work. You're a thief. The numbers were correct, but the truth behind them was twisted. It ignored the fact that Sarah was forced into this work, that she was only 9 years old, that she was sick and starving. It ignored that she never chose to be born enslaved and never agreed to any of this. None of that mattered to Briggs. In his view, enslaved people existed only to make money. Those who failed to do so had no worth and no right to complain. Briggs dragged Sarah to the center of the field where everyone could see her. This was normal. Punishment was always public. It was meant to frighten others and keep control. He pulled out his whip, a braided strip of leather about 5 feet long that could tear skin with a single strike. Maybe pain will teach you. Maybe if your back hurts worse than your arms, you'll work faster. Esther stepped forward from 3 rows away, but Daniel grabbed her arm and stopped her. His face was full of pain, but he shook his head. Interfering would only mean 2 people beaten instead of 1 or worse. They had learned that lesson long ago. You could not save everyone. Sometimes you could save no one. All you could do was survive and hope tomorrow would be better, even though it rarely was. Briggs lifted the whip high, pulling his arm back to strike as hard as he could. Sarah stood still. She did not run. She did not cry. She simply waited for the pain she knew was coming. She had been whipped many times before. She knew how it felt, how the skin split and burned, how blood ran down her back, how she would have to sleep on her stomach for days while the wounds tried to heal and often became infected in the filthy cabin. She accepted it because she had no choice, but before the whip came down, Sarah collapsed. She fell like her strings had been cut, like a puppet dropped to the ground. Her eyes rolled back until only the whites showed. Her body went limp and folded into the dirt. She did not brace herself or put out her hands. She fell like something already dead. Briggs froze for a moment, whip still raised, confused. He kicked her with his boot hard. Get up. Get up now, or I'll make it worse. I'll whip you until you can't walk." Sarah did not move. She did not respond. Her chest barely rose and fell. Her breathing was shallow and weak. Her skin looked pale, almost gray. Her lips were turning blue. Daniel broke from his row and ran to her before anyone could stop him. He knew he would be punished, but he did not care. He knelt beside Sarah and placed his hand on her chest, feeling her heart beat. It was there, but wrong, uneven and faint, as if it might stop at any second. She's not breathing right. Something is very wrong. She needs a doctor. She's really sick. Briggs kicked Daniel hard in the ribs, sending him sprawling. Get back to work or you'll end up beside her. But Daniel stayed where he was, shielding Sarah with his body. She's dying. Can't you see that? She's dying right here in the dirt. At least let her die in the shade. At least give her that. Briggs looked down at Sarah's still body and swore under his breath. If she died in the field from a whipping, there would be questions. It was making the whole most direct of it whole there like it all was and by the whole was the same and then what the best so almost He reached the gravesite out of breath, his chest heaving from the effort, his aging heart pounding painfully hard. Then he saw Sarah standing there, covered in dirt from head to toe, but clearly alive and fully aware. The color drained from his face. His knees weakened, and he nearly collapsed where he stood. Someone nearby grabbed his arm quickly to keep him from falling. This made no sense. He had declared her dead. He had filled out and signed the death certificate himself. He had been totally sure, medically and professionally, with no doubt at all. Yet there she was, standing upright, breathing, staring straight at him with those strange, knowing eyes that sent a chill through him. Dr. Merritt forced himself to move forward, his years of medical training pushing past his rising panic. He reached for Sarah's wrist and pressed his fingers against the spot where he knew the pulse should be. It was there. Strong, steady. Beating at around 70 beats a minute, perfectly normal for a child her age. His hands trembled slightly as he leaned in and placed his ear against her chest. Her heart was beating evenly, no skips, no weakness, no signs at all of the failure he had diagnosed 3 days earlier. He gently lifted her eyelids and shined his torch into her eyes. Her pupils reacted normally to the light. There was no sign of the rolled back, fixed stare of death he clearly remembered seeing. He pressed his hand to her forehead and neck to check her temperature. She was warm, normal, not cold and stiff like a corpse, and not burning with fever like she had been before. He checked her hands and feet. Blood flow was good. Color was returning. When he asked her to move her fingers and toes, she did so easily. He listened carefully to her lungs. They were clear. No fluid, no crackling, no sign at all of the pneumonia that had been killing her 72 hours earlier. This can't be happening, Dr. Merritt whispered, mostly to himself. You were dead. I checked again and again. I checked 4 times. You had no pulse, no heartbeat, no breathing. Your body was cold. Your eyes were fixed. By every medical rule I know, you were dead. His hands were shaking now. Everything he believed about medicine, about the human body, was falling apart because of this small child standing in front of him, covered in grave dirt. Sarah met his gaze calmly, her eyes clear and focused, far too old for a 9-year-old face. I was dead, Dr. Merritt. You weren't wrong. You did your job correctly. My heart stopped at 8:35 p.m. on August 15th. My breathing stopped. My brain stopped getting oxygen. I died. She spoke with confidence and certainty, with knowledge no child should have. But death isn't always the end. Sometimes death can be undone. Sometimes what is gone is allowed to return. At that moment, Margaret Sutton arrived. She was wrapped in a robe, even though the night was warm, her gray hair loose and messy around her shoulders. Her face showed anger at being dragged out of bed in the middle of the night. Sleep had been difficult for her lately. Filled with strange dreams she couldn't remember clearly, and this disturbance had pulled her from the deepest rest she had had in days. She pushed her way through the gathered enslaved people and staff, demanding answers. What kind of emergency justified waking the entire plantation at such an hour? Then she saw Sarah standing beside her own grave. Margaret froze mid-sentence. Her mouth fell open, her eyes widened in disbelief. For several long moments, her mind refused to accept what she was seeing. It insisted this must be someone else, another child who looked similar, because Sarah Sutton had died and been buried 3 days ago. But the face was unmistakable, even smeared with dirt. The small, thin body was the same. The torn dress was the same one Sarah had been buried in. Confusion crossed Margaret's face, then slowly turned into something close to fear, though she would never admit it. Margaret was a woman who trusted numbers and records, facts and calculations. She believed in things that could be measured and controlled. Death was final. Dead people stayed dead. That was a basic rule of life. And yet here was proof that the rule might not always apply, that the world might be far more dangerous and unpredictable than her orderly books and ledgers suggested. "Explain this," Margaret demanded sharply, though her voice shook slightly beneath the command. "Explain it right now. Dr. Merritt, what is going on here? How is this possible?" Her eyes swept over the crowd, taking in the shocked faces, the fear, and something else she didn't like at all, something that looked like hope or satisfaction on the faces of the enslaved people. Merritt struggled to speak, stumbling over his words as he searched desperately for an explanation that fit within his medical understanding. It could have been catalepsy. It's rare, but it happens. The body enters a state that looks exactly like death. The pulse becomes almost impossible to feel. Breathing slows to maybe 1 breath a minute. The heart might beat only 5 or 6 times per minute. It can fool even experienced doctors. I must have missed it. I must have made a mistake. Everyone knew he was reaching for anything that might save him from the truth. Catalepsy could not explain how a child survived 3 days buried underground without air. Even if Sarah had been in such a state when buried, she would have suffocated within minutes once the dirt covered her. The cloth wrapping alone would have blocked any air that might have passed through the soil. There was no medical answer for this, none. Coleman Briggs stepped forward, gripping his rifle tightly. He had moved past his first shock and into anger, as he often did when faced with something he didn't understand. Anger felt safer than fear. "Maybe she wasn't fully dead," he said roughly. "Maybe she woke up down there and dug her way out." Even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't true. He had helped bury her. He knew how deep the grave was. A grown man would struggle to escape from that depth. A weak, sick 9-year-old child couldn't have done it. Sarah looked directly at Briggs, and to his own surprise, he stepped backward. Despite his size, his strength, and the weapon in his hands, something in her gaze stripped him of his confidence and made him feel small. "I didn't dig myself out, Mr. Briggs," she said quietly. "The earth let me go. It didn't want me. Death sent me back." Her voice was soft, but it carried clearly to everyone standing there. "I was in darkness for a long time. It was cold. I was alone. I couldn't breathe, but I didn't need to. I couldn't move, but I felt no pain. I just existed in nothing for what felt like forever." She slowly turned, looking at every face around her. Then something spoke to me. Not with sound, but I understood it. It said I could stay there or I could return. But if I came back, I would have to finish something. I would have to fix what was wrong. I would have to show them. Her eyes settled on Margaret. "Show them what they did. Show them what we are worth. Show them that you can't throw people away like trash and expect nothing to happen." The enslaved people began to murmur, quiet whispers spreading through the crowd. Some made protective signs passed down from their ancestors, gestures meant to guard against spirits and unnatural forces. Others whispered prayers, calling on Jesus or older gods for safety. But some looked at Sarah with something else entirely: recognition, as if she represented something they had been waiting for without realizing it. They all understood, even if they couldn't explain it. This was not a medical error. This was not someone waking from a coma. This was something that should not exist, yet did. The natural order had bent or broken. Something had crossed a boundary, resurrection, visitation, or something without a name. Whatever it was real, and it stood before them coated in grave soil. Margaret tried to regain control, to force her authority back into place. "This is foolishness," she said sharply. "Superstitious nonsense. The girl was in a coma or a cataleptic state. Merritt made a reasonable mistake. Sarah, you were sick and confused. You woke up disoriented and somehow dug yourself out. That's all this is. A medical error and a lucky survival." Her voice was firm, but her shaking hands betrayed her fear. "Everyone go back to bed. Sarah will be examined properly in the morning. This is finished." No one moved. They stood frozen, eyes fixed on Sarah, waiting. The balance of power had shifted, and Margaret could feel it even if she couldn't explain it. Her words, which once would have sent everyone scattering, had no effect. For the first time in her life, Margaret Sutton stood before enslaved people and felt completely powerless. Sarah looked at her for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was calm and unshakable. "You're lying, Mrs. Sutton, to them and to yourself. You know I was dead. Dr. Merritt knows it. Mr. Briggs knows it. Everyone here knows it. I had no heartbeat, no breath. I was cold and stiff. I was dead for 3 days." She stepped forward, and Margaret stepped back, something she would never have done before. "3 days ago, you decided I wasn't worth saving. You did the numbers, $5 for medicine versus $250 of value. You decided my life wasn't worth the cost." The crowd was silent now, every person listening, every eye watching as a small child stood without fear before the most powerful woman on the plantation. Sarah's voice grew stronger. "You put a price on my life and decided it was too low. They let me die just to save $5. You buried me behind the barn like I was a dead animal because you decided I had no value." Margaret's face turned red with anger and shame. "That is not how it happened. That is not fair. Medical choices are not simple. The doctors said the treatment would not work. You were already too far gone. I made a practical choice based on professional advice." But her voice sounded weak and defensive, and it did not have its usual power because Sarah was right. That was exactly what had happened. Margaret had done the math and decided Sarah was not worth the expense. Sarah smiled, and it was not the smile of a child. It was old and knowing and heavy in a way no 9-year-old should ever be. "I know my value now, Mrs. Sutton. I am worth more than your entire plantation. I am worth more than everything you own because I came back from death. I walked through darkness and returned to the light. I crossed a line no one is meant to cross, and then I crossed it again to come back. I am living proof that your numbers mean nothing, that your books do not record what truly matters, that you do not control the world the way you think you do." She opened her arms wide and motioned to the people gathered around. "All of us are worth more than the prices you place on us. Every single person here. We are not stock. We are not property. We are human beings with souls and dignity, and I came back to prove that. I came back to show everyone who you really are, what you did and what you keep doing every single day to all of us." Margaret tried to speak, but no sound came out. She opened her mouth and shut it again, her face moving through anger, fear, and confusion. She looked around at the crowd, at her overseer, at the doctor, hoping someone would support her and bring things back under control. But Briggs was staring at Sarah with fear he could not hide. Merritt was trembling, his skin pale, unable to understand what he was seeing with everything he believed about medicine. And the enslaved people were staring at Sarah in a way that frightened Margaret more than anything else. They looked at her with hope, with belief, with a dangerous kind of faith that could lead to rebellion and uprising and the fall of the system that kept them obedient. Hope was the most dangerous thing a slave could have. Hope made people stop accepting their suffering. Hope made them imagine different lives. Hope made them ready to risk everything for the chance of something better. Briggs finally spoke, trying to take control the only way he knew how, through threats and force. He lifted his rifle and aimed it at Sarah, his finger tight on the trigger. "That is enough. You will not speak to Mrs. Sutton like that. You are still property. You are still a slave. You do not get to give speeches or make accusations. This ends now. You are going to—" He stopped because Sarah was looking at him, truly looking at him, and her eyes were different now. Darker, deeper, like staring into a bottomless well, like looking into the empty space between stars. Her pupils seemed to spread until they swallowed the whites of her eyes, until there was only darkness staring out from her small face. "You beat me many times, Mr. Briggs. You called me useless. You said I deserved to die. You said I was stealing food just by breathing. You were right about one thing, I did die." Her voice had changed to deeper, layered with sounds that did not feel fully human. "But you were wrong about everything else." Briggs pulled the trigger. The gunshot cracked through the night, the flash bright like lightning, the sound bouncing off the barn and the big house. People screamed, ducked, and fell to the ground. The shot was from very close, only about 10 feet, and Briggs was known as a skilled shooter who could hit a rabbit from far away. But the bullet did not touch Sarah. It hit the ground 3 feet to her left, throwing up dirt. Briggs stared at the rifle, shocked and confused. How could he miss? How was that possible? He lifted the rifle again, aiming carefully, his hands shaking but his focus sharp. He fired again. The bullet flew over Sarah's head by more than 2 feet. He fired again and again until the rifle was empty. Every shot missed, every single one. Despite perfect aim, a still target, and years of experience, the bullets went everywhere except where they should have gone, as if something unseen bent them away at the last second. Sarah walked toward Briggs slowly. He stepped back, his hands shaking so badly that he dropped the empty rifle. His face showed pure terror. All his cruelty and confidence were gone, leaving only a frightened man facing something he could not understand or control. "Stay away from me. Stay away." He turned and ran toward his house, tripping over his own feet, not looking back, running like a child escaping a nightmare. Sarah did not follow him. She only watched him leave, her face calm, almost sad. Then she looked at the enslaved people and her expression softened. When she spoke again, her voice sounded normal, or as normal as it could be. "I am not here to hurt you, any of you. I am not a monster or a demon or anything evil. I am just Sarah. But something happened to me during those 3 days. Something changed me, showed me things, gave me a purpose." She looked at Margaret again. "I am here because of those who hurt us. The ones who decided our lives did not matter. The ones who treated us like animals or tools or numbers on a page. It begins with them." She pointed at Margaret. "It begins with the people who do the math, who decide who lives and who dies based on profit, who build a world where a child's life is worth less than $5 of medicine." Margaret finally spoke, but her voice was thin and shaky. "You are insane. You are a child suffering delusions from trauma and lack of air. Someone take her and lock her in the barn until morning. We will deal with this later when people can think clearly." But no one moved. No one wanted to touch Sarah. Even the white workers, who would normally rush to obey, stood frozen, unwilling to go near the small girl who had clawed her way out of a grave. Sarah looked around one last time, her eyes resting on Esther, on Daniel, on the others who had known her, who had seen her suffer, who had cried when she died. "I came back to fix what was broken, to show the truth. It will not be fast and it will not be easy, but it will happen. Justice is coming to Blackwood Plantation. Not the kind that cares about laws or money. The kind that balances the scales no matter the cost." Then she turned and walked toward the slave quarters, toward the cabin she shared with Esther. The crowd moved aside, quickly making a path for her. Some people reached out as if to touch her, but pulled back at the last moment, afraid or respectful or both. Sarah walked with her head held high, her back straight, moving with a confidence she had never shown before. She looked like someone who had nothing left to fear, because she had already faced the worst and survived. She entered the cabin and lay down on her sleeping mat, the same mat she had used for 9 years, where her spirit had died long before her body did. Esther followed her inside, not knowing what else to do, needing to stay close to the child she had tried to protect and failed to save. Sarah closed her eyes and within minutes seemed asleep, her breathing slow and steady, her face peaceful in a way it had never been before. Esther sat beside her, staring at the girl who had died and somehow returned. She carefully touched Sarah's face, half expecting her hand to pass through like touching a ghost. But the skin was warm and solid, real and alive. When Esther pulled her hand back, there was dirt on her fingers. Dirt from the grave soil that had covered Sarah for 3 days, earth that should have been her final bed. And deep in her heart, in the part that remembered the old beliefs her grandmother taught before they were pushed aside, Esther knew Sarah had spoken the truth. She had died, she had gone somewhere beyond life, and she had come back for a reason. The dead did not return without purpose. They came back when wrongs remained unpaid, when justice was denied, when balance had to be restored. Outside, the crowd slowly broke apart, people returning to their cabins knowing sleep would not come. They would lie awake replaying what they had seen, trying to understand it, trying to fit it into the way they believed the world worked. Some would pray. Some would cry. Some would feel hope for the first time in years. Hope that their pain might not last forever. Hope that something in the universe cared about justice even when people did not. Margaret stood in front of her house staring toward the quarters, her thoughts racing. This had to be explained, controlled, and contained before it spread beyond the plantation. People did not rise from the dead. That was superstition, ignorance, old foolish beliefs. There had to be a logical answer, catalepsy, a mistake, a scientific reason that fit within the laws she trusted. But deep inside, in the part of her that still believed in things beyond money and ownership, the part she tried to silence because it got in the way of business, Margaret knew something terrible had occurred. Something had changed at Blackwood Plantation on that hot August night. The natural order had been broken. The dead had come back, and whatever happened next, whatever results followed from that impossible return, would not be something she could control. Dr. Merritt sat alone in his room staring at the death paper he had signed 3 days earlier. The page felt like it was laughing at him, every line showing his failure, proof that his confidence had been wrong, that his skill and judgment meant nothing. Sarah Sutton, age 9, declared dead at 8:35 in the evening on August 15, 1856. Cause pneumonia and total body failure. He had written his name, signed the date, and entered it into his book without any doubt at all. But Sarah Sutton was not dead. She was sleeping in the quarters right now, breathing softly, alive and warm. He had been wrong, or the world had broken its own rules. Either way, his hands would not stop shaking. Either way, everything he believed about medicine, life, death, and the thin line between them was destroyed. He reached for a bottle of whiskey, something he almost never touched, and poured a heavy glass. He needed the fear to fade, needed his thoughts to slow, needed to forget the look in Sarah's eyes when she quietly said, "I was dead." Coleman Briggs locked himself inside his room, shoving heavy furniture against the door and loading every weapon he owned. 6 rifles were lined up ready, and 2 pistols sat loaded within reach. He kept the lamps burning bright, afraid of the dark, afraid of what might be waiting inside it. Every small noise made him flinch. Every soft sound of wood felt like footsteps coming closer. Every movement of curtains in the wind looked like a small shape standing still and watching. He told himself again and again that he was not scared of a child. He had broken full-grown men, had beaten them while they begged, and had laughed while doing it. He was strong, powerful, feared by everyone on the plantation. But what he had seen, what had looked back at him, what had spoken to him, was not a child. It was something else wearing a child's face, and it knew him. It knew every time he had struck her, every cruel word, every moment of pain he caused. It remembered everything, and now it had returned to collect what was owed. As morning drew near on August 19th, Blackwood Plantation rested in a strange silence that felt heavier than shouting or gunfire. The sun would rise soon, turning the sky red and orange. People would still have to go to the fields. Work would still go on. Cotton did not wait even when the impossible happened during the night. Margaret would try to bring order back to the place, to make people forget what they had seen, to explain it as a mistaken illness, shared fear, nothing more. But they all knew better. Something had returned from death, something that remembered every act of cruelty, every unfair choice, every moment when profit mattered more than human life. Something that spoke of balance, justice, and debts that had to be paid. Whether it was truly Sarah Sutton back from the grave or something else using her body, the outcome was the same. Blackwood Plantation would never be the same again. The morning of August 19th arrived gray and heavy. Clouds covered the sky, promising rain but giving none. They just hung there, dark and pressing like a low ceiling. The air felt thick and wrong, hard to breathe, full of tension. The plantation felt changed, though nothing you could touch was different. It was the feeling, the sense that the land itself knew something terrible had happened, and was waiting to see what would follow. The bell rang at 5 in the morning, as it always did, calling people to work. But this time many stayed near their cabins, unwilling to leave. They stood in small groups, whispering and looking toward the cabin where Sarah slept, afraid to go close yet unable to turn away. Some of the braver ones walked up to Esther's cabin and looked through cracks in the walls, trying to see if Sarah was really there, if she was real, if last night had truly happened, or if it had been a shared dream born from heat, exhaustion, and despair. Sarah was there, asleep, calm, her chest moving in steady breaths. In the early light she looked normal, just a small girl who needed washing and rest. But everyone who saw her felt it, that wrong feeling, that quiet knowledge that this was not the same Sarah who had died 3 days before. Something deep had changed, something important was no longer the same. Margaret Sutton had not slept at all. She sat at her desk in the main house, still wearing her night clothes, staring at her account books without seeing the numbers. Her mind kept replaying the image of a child climbing out of a grave, walking and speaking after being dead for 3 days. Margaret was a woman who trusted facts, numbers, things that could be counted, measured, and controlled. Death was final. The dead stayed dead. That rule was solid, maybe the most solid rule of all. Yet what she had seen broke that rule completely and clearly. It shook everything she believed in. If death was not final, if the dead could return, if the natural laws she depended on could fail so easily, then what else was wrong? What other truths were false? What other rules might bend or snap when pushed? At 6 in the morning she sent for Dr. Merritt and Coleman Briggs to meet her in the study. This situation had to be discussed, a plan had to be made, control had to be taken back before it went further. Dr. Merritt arrived looking awful, his eyes red, his hands shaking as he poured coffee prepared by the house slaves. He looked 10 years older than the day before, his face tired and drawn, his confidence gone. Briggs was worse. He arrived 15 minutes late, something that never happened before. He carried 2 loaded pistols on his belt and a rifle over his shoulder. His eyes moved constantly, watching every corner, every shadow. Dark circles sat under his eyes from a night without sleep. His usual pride was gone, replaced by tight fear barely held back. He sat across from Margaret but kept his weapons close and ready. They sat in silence for a moment, heavy and tense. Then Margaret spoke, steady but with a slight shake she could not hide. "We must control this before it grows. Before word leaves the plantation, before panic spreads or worse." She looked at both men, making sure they listened. The official story is that Sarah was in a cataleptic state. Dr. Merritt made a reasonable medical mistake. She recovered and dug herself out. That is what everyone will be told. That is what is written down. Dr. Merritt nodded quickly, thankful for any answer that did not force him to face the impossible. Yes, catalepsy, it is rare but known. The body looks dead, signs are nearly gone. I should have seen it, should have checked more carefully. It was my error. He knew he was lying, but lies were easier than a truth that destroyed everything he understood. Briggs leaned forward, his teeth clenched. "What about what she said about coming back, about making things right? She threatened you directly. That cannot be allowed. She must be punished, sold south at once, before she causes real damage, before she fills others with her madness." His voice shook with fear and urgency, the need to remove the thing that terrified him. Margaret thought carefully. Selling Sarah would remove her from Blackwood, but it would also spread the story. Every place she went, every trader, every enslaved person would hear about the girl who died and returned. The story would spread fast through hidden paths of communication, faster than any machine. That kind of story was dangerous. It would create hope, and hope was the most dangerous thing of all. Hope made people question their suffering. Hope made them imagine other lives. Hope led to resistance, escape, rebellion, and loss. Years earlier Nat Turner had begun with belief. What would happen if people believed a child had returned from death to bring justice? No, Margaret decided. She stays here where we control her and the story. If she leaves, the story grows larger each time it is told. Here we keep it small. We explain it as a medical mistake, nothing more. She looked at both men, firm and certain. Sarah is ill, confused, harmed by being buried alive. Her mind suffered from lack of air. She speaks nonsense because of trauma. We treat her gently and kindly. We show reason and care. We prove her words are those of a confused child. That is how we deal with this. Yet even as Margaret spoke, even as they all agreed, they knew they were lying to themselves. They had seen Sarah's eyes. They had heard the strength in her voice. They had felt how wrong her presence was. This was not confusion. This was not illness. This was something else entirely, and it was not finished. Something about it did not fit into their neat explanations or their logical way of seeing the world. At exactly 7:00 a.m., Margaret sent word for Sarah to be brought to her. Esther came to fetch the girl and slowly led her toward the main house. Sarah's small fingers rested in Esther's rough, worn hand. The child had been cleaned carefully. All the grave soil had been washed from her hair and skin, and she had been dressed in fresh, simple clothes. In the early morning light, as she walked into the plantation house, she looked almost ordinary. She was just a thin 9-year-old girl, smaller than most children her age, with nothing unusual or frightening about her appearance. But the moment she stepped into Margaret's study and stood on the other side of the desk from the woman who owned her, the woman who had decided she was not worth saving, the feeling in the room shifted. It was as if the air grew colder. The space felt heavier, harder to breathe in. The sunlight coming through the windows seemed weaker, as though something unseen was blocking it. Margaret felt it at once. Briggs felt it too. Dr. Merritt felt it as well. It was the shared sense of standing near something that should not exist at all. Margaret watched Sarah closely, searching her face for any sign of the terrifying figure from the night before. She looked for marks of illness, madness, or injury, anything that would support her explanation of fear, sickness, and confusion. But Sarah only looked back at her calmly. Her eyes were clear and steady. They were old eyes in a young face, eyes that seemed to have seen things Margaret could never imagine. Those eyes judged her, and Margaret knew she was being found lacking. "Sarah," Margaret said at last, using the softest voice she could manage, the one she saved for important visitors or difficult discussions, "you frightened everyone badly last night. Dr. Merritt tells me you were extremely ill. You fell into a deep state called catalepsy that made you appear dead. It is rare, but it does happen. The body shuts down to protect itself. That is why we believed you had died. That is why you were buried. It was a mistake. A terrible mistake, but an understandable one." Margaret leaned forward slightly, trying to look caring and concerned instead of cold and calculating. "I know you said some troubling things last night. You talked about dying and coming back, about fixing wrongs, about justice. I understand that you were scared and confused. You woke up buried underground. That would terrify anyone, especially a child. Your mind was trying to make sense of something traumatic, so it created a story about death and returning to life." She smiled, attempting to appear warm and motherly, though the expression did not sit naturally on her strict face. "But that is not what truly happened. You were never really dead. You were very sick, and you fell into a special kind of sleep. Dr. Merritt made a mistake, one he deeply regrets. You were buried by accident. You woke up, somehow dug your way out, and now you are recovering. That is the truth. That is what actually happened. Do you understand?" Sarah stared at Margaret without blinking. Her gaze did not waver. When she spoke, her voice was soft, but every word was clear. "You are lying to me, to yourself, and to everyone else. You know I was dead. You are just afraid to admit it because it breaks the way you believe the world works. It means there are forces greater than you, powers you cannot control, and consequences you cannot explain away." Margaret's jaw tightened sharply. "That is enough. I am trying to be patient with you. I am trying to remember that you are confused and traumatized, but you will not speak to me like that. You are a child, and you are my property. You will show respect." Even as she said the words, they felt empty and weak. How do you threaten someone who has already died? How do you control someone who no longer fears anything? Sarah tilted her head slightly, studying Margaret the way Margaret might study a troubling number in her accounts. "I do not hate you, Mrs. Sutton. Maybe I should, but I do not. I understand you. You are shaped by your time and by this system. You were taught that people like me are property, that our lives are worth only what money says they are. You are doing what makes sense in your world." She stepped closer to the desk, and Margaret fought the urge to lean back. "But you are wrong, and what happened to me proves it. I died because you decided that saving me cost more than I was worth. $5 instead of $250. A bad investment, not worth it. Let her die." Sarah's voice stayed calm, almost casual, which made her words hurt even more. "You put a price on my life. You do it every day to everyone here. You measure our worth like animals or tools. But human lives do not have prices, Mrs. Sutton. They are endless. They cannot be measured. And when you treat people like things, when you let them die because of money, there are consequences." Margaret stood up suddenly, her chair scraping loudly across the floor. "I will not be lectured by a child. I will not feel guilty for making practical decisions. This plantation does not survive on feelings. It survives on numbers and business. We have limited resources. Choices must be made. Not everyone can be saved. That is reality." "You are right," Sarah said quietly. "Resources are limited. Choices must be made. But the choices you make show who you truly are. They shape your soul. And you chose to let a 9-year-old girl die rather than spend $5 on medicine. That choice tells me everything about you, and it will follow you for the rest of your life." She turned toward the door, then stopped. "You asked why I came back. I came back to make you see what you have done, and what you continue to do. I came back so you cannot forget the people you decide are not worth saving. I came back to stay in your thoughts until you change, or until it destroys you." Sarah walked out, leaving Margaret standing there, shaking with anger, fear, and something else she refused to name. Behind her, Briggs looked pale and sweaty, his hands resting on his guns. He seemed ready to shoot Sarah, yet too afraid to try after what had happened the night before. "Doctor." Merritt stared down at his hands, the same hands that held the tools of his profession, tools that had failed him when it mattered most. The three of them remained silent for a long time. At last, Briggs spoke roughly. "We should kill her tonight, make it look like an accident. A fall, a snake bite, something natural. She is too dangerous. She will ruin everything." Margaret thought about it. The fact that she even considered killing a 9-year-old child showed how desperate they had become. But she shook her head. "No, if she dies, she becomes a legend. The story grows stronger. Alive, she is just a confused child. Over time, we can discredit her. She did not say what she truly feared. That trying to kill Sarah might fail again. That bullets had missed her for reasons no one could explain. That perhaps ordinary methods could not kill her at all. It was safer to pretend nothing was wrong and hope people would forget, that life would return to routine, and that this would fade like a bad dream. But Blackwood Plantation would never return to normal. The days that followed made that clear. Strange things began to happen. Small things at first, easy to dismiss as coincidence. The dogs would not go near Sarah. They barked at her from far away but refused to approach, even when ordered or tempted with food. If forced closer, they whined and shook, their tails tucked tightly. The horses grew nervous around her. Calm, trained animals suddenly reared and tried to run when she came within 20 feet. Certain paths had to be abandoned because horses refused to go near the slave quarters where Sarah lived. Even the chickens behaved oddly. The ones closest to Sarah's cabin stopped laying eggs. They paced restlessly, refused to settle, and made distressed noises day and night. After 3 days, they were moved before they died from stress. The plants in the field where Sarah had collapsed began to die. A circle about 20 feet wide turned brown despite proper care. Cotton bolls dried up, leaves curled and fell. Within a week, the land was bare while the rest of the field thrived. Workers refused to go near it, saying they felt watched, saying the ground itself pushed them away. Then people began to fall ill. It started with Dr. Merritt. On August 20th, one day after Sarah's return, he developed a cough that would not stop. By the next day, he had a fever. By the third, he was struggling to breathe. The signs were unmistakable. Lying in his bed and listening to fluid fill his lungs, Dr. Merritt recognized the disease with growing terror. It was pneumonia, the same illness that was supposed to have killed Sarah.